Thomas Crane wasn't the kind of man you'd forget after seeing him once. Standing at 7 feet tall with shoulders so broad they barely squeezed through most doorways, he had the kind of presence that made people stop and stare. His hands were the size of dinner plates, and when he walked down the street, his shadow seemed to swallow everything in its path. He'd rolled into the small town of Millbrook about 3 months back, driving an old pickup truck that looked too small for him. The truck bed was packed with just a few belongings, some boxes, a worn leather suitcase, and not much else. He hadn't come looking for friends or a fresh start filled with warm welcomes. He just needed work and a quiet place to exist. The job posting at the cemetery had been perfect. Groundskeeper wanted, must be willing to work alone. The pay wasn't great, but it came with a small cottage tucked behind the iron gates, surrounded by old headstones and ancient oak trees. Thomas had taken one look at the place and knew it was exactly what he needed. No crowds, no questions. Just him and the peaceful silence of the dead. The cemetery sat on the eastern edge of town, where the main street faded into dirt roads and wild grass. It was old, dating back more than 100 years, with headstones that leaned at odd angles and marble angels whose faces had been worn smooth by time and weather. Most folks only came by on Sundays or holidays, which meant Thomas had the place mostly to himself. He fell into a routine quickly. Every morning before sunrise, he'd wake up in the tiny cottage and make coffee in a pot that looked like a toy in his massive hands. Then he'd spend the day working, mowing the grass, trimming hedges, pulling weeds from between the graves, planting flowers where families had requested them. The work was simple and honest, and it didn't require him to talk to anyone. But even in a place meant for solitude, Thomas couldn't escape the stares. When he walked into town for supplies, the reaction was always the same. Mothers would spot him from half a block away and quickly pull their children to the other side of the street. Their eyes would widen, and they'd grip their little ones' hands tighter, whispering things Thomas couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Store owners would watch him through their windows, and he could feel their nervous energy even before he pushed open their doors. At the hardware store, where he bought tools and supplies for the cemetery, the young clerk behind the counter couldn't hide his fear. The kid's hands would shake when he rang up Thomas's purchases, and coins would slip through his fingers, clattering across the counter like tiny bells of alarm. Thomas always spoke quietly, said please and thank you, moved slowly and deliberately. But it never seemed to matter. The grocery store wasn't much better. People in the aisles would freeze when they turned a corner and found him there, this giant of a man studying cereal boxes or comparing prices on bread. They'd back up, mumble an apology, and hurry away. Sometimes he'd hear whispers trailing behind him as he pushed his cart down the aisles. Did you see the size of him? What's a man like that doing in a town like this? I heard he lives at the cemetery. Creepy, if you ask me. Thomas had lived with this his whole life, so it shouldn't have hurt anymore. But somehow it always did. Every nervous glance, every pulled-away child, every conversation that died when he entered a room. They all added up like paper cuts that never quite healed. He'd been different from the start. Even as a kid, he'd towered over his classmates, and by high school, he'd stopped growing at 7 feet. His parents had been good people, loving people, but even they sometimes looked at him with a mixture of concern and confusion, as if wondering where this giant had come from. They'd passed away years ago, leaving Thomas to navigate a world that seemed built for people half his size. He'd tried different towns, different jobs, different versions of himself. He'd worked construction sites where his size was useful, warehouse jobs where strength mattered more than appearance, loading docks where he barely saw another soul all day. But nowhere ever felt like home. People either feared him or wanted to use him, and Thomas had grown tired of both. So he'd learned to make himself smaller in the ways that mattered. He kept his voice low and gentle. He moved carefully, telegraphing his movements so he wouldn't startle anyone. He avoided eye contact on the street. He shopped early in the morning or late at night when stores were nearly empty. He became an expert at taking up as little space as possible for a man his size. The cottage behind the cemetery became his refuge. It was small and simple, just one bedroom, a kitchen with a table for one and a living room with a fireplace that worked more often than not. The furniture was old but sturdy, and Thomas had added a few touches to make it feel like his. Books lined a shelf he'd built himself. A comfortable chair sat by the window where he could read at night. A coffee mug that actually fit his hand sat on the counter. His only regular visitor was a scruffy orange cat that had shown up during his second week in Millbrook. The cat was missing half an ear and had a crooked tail, and it watched Thomas from a distance for days before deciding he was safe. Thomas started leaving scraps of food by the tool shed, and eventually the cat would sit nearby while he worked, soaking up the afternoon sun. He called the cat Rusty, though he'd never said the name out loud to another living soul. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun set and the shadows grew long across the headstones, Thomas would sit in his cottage and feel the weight of his loneliness settle over him like a heavy blanket. He'd read books by lamplight, adventure stories mostly, tales of heroes who were celebrated instead of feared. Sometimes he'd wonder what it would be like to walk into a room and have people smile instead of tense up, to have a conversation that lasted more than 30 seconds, to have a friend, but he'd learned not to hope too much. Hope had a way of making disappointment hurt worse, so he kept to his routine. He tended the graves with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who bothered to watch. When he planted flowers, his enormous fingers worked with the delicacy of a jeweler, carefully tucking each root into the soil. When he cleaned headstones, he was respectful and thorough, treating each marker as if it belonged to someone he'd known. The dead didn't judge him. The dead didn't pull away. At night, lying in his narrow bed and listening to the wind move through the trees outside, Thomas would sometimes let himself imagine a different life, one where his size didn't define him, where children would wave instead of hide, where he could sit in a coffee shop without clearing the room, where someone might see him, really see him and not flinch. But those were just dreams, whispers in the dark that faded with the morning light. Thomas Crane had learned to expect nothing from the world, and the world had mostly obliged. He didn't know that everything was about to change. He didn't know that sometimes it takes the smallest person to see the biggest truth, and he certainly didn't know that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered by the sound of a crying baby on a misty October morning. Grace Hayes had been a widow for 6 months, though some days it felt like 6 years and other days it felt like 6 minutes. Her husband Daniel had died suddenly, a heart attack at 34 that no one saw coming. One morning he'd kissed her goodbye, headed to work at the accounting firm downtown, and never came home. Just like that, Grace's whole world had collapsed. Now she was left with a 6-month-old daughter, a house that felt too big and too empty, and a drafting business she ran from the spare bedroom. Before Daniel died, Grace had worked for an architecture firm, drawing up building plans and technical designs. After his death, she couldn't face going back to an office, couldn't handle the sympathetic looks and whispered conversations. So she'd gone freelance, taking on projects she could do from home while caring for baby Lily. The work helped. When she was focused on measurements and angles, on making sure every line was perfect, she could forget for a little while that her husband was gone. But then Lily would cry, or Grace would reach for her phone to text Daniel something funny, or she'd roll over in bed and find his side cold and empty. The grief would come rushing back, heavy and suffocating. Every Sunday morning, Grace would bundle Lily up and drive to Millbrook Cemetery. Daniel was buried under a large oak tree in the older section, the one with the wrought iron fence and the weathered headstones. Grace would sit on the grass beside his grave and talk to him, telling him about her week, about Lily's new sounds and expressions, about the loneliness that never quite went away. She knew it was probably silly. Daniel wasn't there, not really. But it made her feel connected to him somehow, like he wasn't completely gone as long as she kept talking to him. This particular Sunday in October had started rough. Lily had been fussy since 4 a.m, crying in a way that Grace couldn't figure out. It wasn't the hungry cry or the tired cry or the wet diaper cry. It was something else, something desperate and inconsolable that made Grace feel like she was failing at the most basic part of being a mother. She'd tried everything. Feeding, changing, rocking, singing, walking around the house, driving around the block. Nothing worked. Lily just kept crying, her little face red and scrunched up, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grace had cried too, standing in the middle of the nursery at 3 a.m, feeling completely overwhelmed and alone. But she'd iced herself she'd visit Daniel today, so she'd loaded the still crying Lily into the car seat and driven to the cemetery anyway. Maybe the fresh air would help. Maybe the change of scenery would calm the baby down. Or maybe Grace just needed to be near Daniel, needed to feel like she wasn't doing this completely alone. The morning was cool and misty, the kind of October day where you could see your breath in the air. The cemetery was quiet except for Lily's wails, which seemed to echo off the headstones and bounce back twice as loud. Grace sat down heavily on the grass beside Daniel's grave, exhausted beyond words. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," she whispered to the headstone, tears starting in her own eyes. "She won't stop crying. I've tried everything, Daniel, everything, and I don't know how to do this without you." Lily wailed louder, and Grace felt her own composure cracking. She was so tired. So desperately tired, not just physically, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than 2 hours straight. But tired in her soul, tired of being strong, tired of pretending she had things under control. That's when she noticed movement through the mist. A figure was approaching through the rows of headstones, and Grace's first thought was that it couldn't be human. It was too big, too tall, moving through the fog like something from a dream or a nightmare. Her second thought was that she should be scared, should grab Lily and run. But she was too exhausted to run, and something about the way the figure moved made her pause. He emerged from the mist slowly, and Grace recognized him immediately. Everyone in Millbrook knew about Thomas Crane, the giant who lived at the cemetery. Grace had seen him from a distance before, working among the graves, but she'd never been this close. He was even bigger than she'd realized, absolutely massive, with shoulders that seemed wider than her kitchen table. Every warning bell in Grace's head was ringing. This was the man mothers warned their children about, the one people crossed the street to avoid. She should grab Lily and leave right now. But something made her stay frozen in place. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was grief making her reckless. Or maybe it was the expression on his face, cautious, almost apologetic, like he was more afraid of her than she was of him. Thomas stopped about 10 feet away, keeping his distance. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, barely above a whisper, like he was afraid of startling her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to intrude," he said, his eyes flicking between Grace and the crying baby. "I know I probably look frightening. I don't mean any harm. I've been working here all morning and I heard the baby crying. I thought maybe I could help." Grace found her voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "I don't think anyone can help. She's been crying for hours." "I don't know what's wrong." Thomas nodded slowly, like he understood. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Sometimes babies just need a different perspective," he said quietly. "If you'd let me, I could try holding her. Sometimes my size helps. Makes them feel secure, like nothing can hurt them." It was the craziest thing Grace had heard all day. Let this enormous stranger hold her baby, her tiny, precious 6-month-old daughter. Every parenting instinct she had screamed no. But she looked at his face, really looked at it, and saw nothing but gentleness there. His eyes were kind, almost sad, like he expected her to say no but had to ask anyway. And Lily was still screaming, had been screaming for hours, and Grace was so tired she could barely think straight. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Okay, you can try." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, like he hadn't actually expected her to agree. He moved forward carefully, each step deliberate and slow. When he knelt down on the grass, he was still taller than Grace sitting down. He held out his hands, palms up, and Grace saw that they were clean despite his work, the nails trimmed short. She lifted Lily from her lap, the baby still wailing, little fists punching the air. Thomas took her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that size. Lily looked ridiculously small against his chest, like a doll in the arms of a bear. Grace's heart was pounding. Every muscle in her body was tensed, ready to snatch her daughter back at the first sign of trouble. She watched Thomas's face intently, looking for any hint of danger. But then something happened that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. Lily stopped crying. Not gradually, not winding down slowly, but just stopped. Her little mouth closed, and she blinked up at Thomas with wide, curious eyes. Then she did something she'd only done a handful of times. She smiled, a real, genuine, gummy baby smile that lit up her whole face. Thomas smiled back, and his entire expression transformed. The intimidating giant disappeared, replaced by someone soft and warm and utterly harmless. "There you go," he murmured to Lily, his deep voice almost musical. "The world's not so scary when you can see more of it, is it?" He stood up slowly, keeping Lily secure against his chest, and started walking in a gentle circle around the grave. "See that bird up there?" he said, pointing to a cardinal in the oak tree. "That's a cardinal. The red ones are the boys. See how the sun's hitting the dew on the grass? Makes it look like diamonds, doesn't it?" Grace sat frozen on the ground, watching this impossible scene unfold. Her daughter, who had been inconsolable for hours, was perfectly content in the arms of a man who terrified most of the town. Lily reached up with one tiny hand and touched Thomas's bearded face, and he laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed across the cemetery. "She's beautiful," Thomas said quietly, still swaying gently. "How old?" "6 months," Grace managed to say. "Her name is Lily." "Lily," Thomas repeated, trying out the name. "That's perfect. Like the flowers." He looked at Grace then, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss. I maintain the graves here. I saw the date on the headstone, recent." Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but different tears this time. 6 months. Same age as her. He never got to meet her. Heart attack. Thomas nodded slowly, and they stood there in silence for a moment. This strange woman and this gentle giant, connected by grief and a baby who had somehow seen past everything that scared adults. "I grew up different," Thomas said after a while, still holding Lily, still swaying. "Always too big, always frightening people without meaning to. Children were usually the worst. They'd scream, hide behind their parents. But babies..." He looked down at Lily with something like wonder. "Babies don't know they're supposed to be afraid yet. They just see what's there. Kindness or the lack of it. That's all that matters to them." Grace stood up, brushing grass from her jeans. She walked closer, close enough to see that Lily had grabbed a handful of Thomas's shirt and was holding on contentedly, close enough to see that his eyes were damp, like this moment meant as much to him as it did to her. "Thank you," Grace said simply. "I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Thomas carefully transferred Lily back to Grace's arms. The baby fussed for just a second, then settled against her mother's shoulder, finally calm. "Anytime," Thomas said quietly. "I'm here most days. If you ever need help, I mean. I know I probably shouldn't offer, but I visit every Sunday," Grace heard herself say. "Maybe I'll see you around." And just like that, something shifted in the misty morning air of Millbrook Cemetery. Two lonely people had found an unexpected connection, and a baby had taught them both something about seeing past the surface to what really matters underneath. Word traveled fast in a small town like Millbrook. By Monday afternoon, half the town had heard that Grace Hayes let the cemetery giant hold her baby. By Tuesday, the story had grown arms and legs. Some versions had Thomas practically kidnapping the child. Others had Grace losing her mind with grief. Margaret Chen, who owned the bakery on Main Street, brought it up while Grace was buying bread. "Honey, I heard something troubling," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper even though they were the only ones in the shop. "About you and that man at the cemetery. The big one. Please tell me it's not true." Grace felt her cheeks flush. She'd known this was coming, but she hadn't expected it so soon. "If you're asking whether Thomas helped me when Lily was crying, yes. That's true." Margaret's eyes went wide. "Grace, sweetie, you don't know anything about him. He could be dangerous." "And your baby was completely safe," Grace said firmly, surprised by the edge in her own voice. "He was kind to us. That's all." But Margaret wasn't the only one. Grace's own mother called that evening, her voice tight with worry. "Gracie, Mrs. Patterson told me something that can't possibly be true. She said you let a stranger hold Lily. At the cemetery of all places." Grace shifted the phone to her other ear, watching Lily play with blocks on the living room floor. "He's not a stranger, Mom. He's the groundskeeper." And yes, he held her for a few minutes. She stopped crying immediately. "Grace Ann Hayes, have you lost your mind?" Her mother's voice rose an octave. "You don't know this man. You don't know where he came from or why he's here. And you handed him your baby?" "I made a judgment call, Mom." "A judgment call? What if he'd run off with her? What if he'd hurt her?" Grace closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of everyone else's opinions pressing down on her. But he didn't. He was gentle and kind, and Lily wasn't afraid of him at all. "Lily's a baby. She doesn't know to be afraid." "Maybe that's the point," Grace said quietly, her mouth. There sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I'm coming over this weekend. We need to talk about this, about your judgment. I'm worried about you, honey." After Grace hung up, she sat on the couch for a long time, staring at nothing. Part of her understood their concern. She was a widow with a baby, and she'd trusted a man who made most of the town nervous. Maybe she had been reckless. Maybe grief had clouded her thinking. But then she remembered Thomas's face when he'd held Lily, the gentleness in his eyes, the way he'd talked about being different his whole life. She remembered how Lily had smiled at him, grabbed his shirt, trusted him completely. On Wednesday, Grace made a decision. She loaded Lily into the stroller and walked to the cemetery. It was a beautiful afternoon, the autumn leaves just starting to turn orange and red, the air crisp and clean. She found Thomas near the back section, planting chrysanthemums beside a headstone. He looked up when he heard the stroller wheels on the gravel path, and something like hope flickered across his face before caution replaced it. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Mrs. Hayes," he said carefully, "I didn't expect to see you before Sunday." "It's Grace," she said, "and I wanted to thank you properly for Sunday. You were kind to us when we needed it." Thomas glanced around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. "I heard people have been talking. I'm sorry if I caused you trouble. That wasn't my intention." "You didn't cause anything," Grace said firmly. "People talk because they don't understand. But I wanted you to know that Lily and I are grateful. And if it's okay with you, maybe we could visit more often? She really seemed to like you." As if on cue, Lily made an excited sound from the stroller, recognizing Thomas. She reached her arms up toward him, making grabbing motions with her little fists. Thomas looked at Grace, silently asking permission, and she nodded. He picked Lily up with that same incredible gentleness, and the baby immediately relaxed against him, grabbing a fistful of his shirt. "Hey there, little Lily," he said softly. "You having a good day?" Grace watched them together, and something warm settled in her chest. It had been so long since she'd felt anything besides grief and exhaustion. "Can I sit?" she asked, gesturing to a nearby bench. "Of course, please." They sat together, Thomas holding Lily while Grace caught her breath. It was the first time in months she'd felt like she could just be still, without worrying about the next thing she had to do. Thomas pointed out things to Lily, a squirrel running up a tree, the way the light caught the stained glass in the old chapel, a butterfly landing on a nearby flower. "You're good with her," Grace said after a while. Thomas shrugged, a massive movement that made Lily giggle. "I like kids. They're honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Is that why you took this job? To be away from people?" He was quiet for a moment, and Grace worried she'd overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've lived in a lot of places, tried a lot of jobs. People always react the same way when they see me. Fear mostly. Sometimes they want to use my size, make me do the heavy lifting, but they don't want to actually know me. After a while, you just get tired of it." "I'm sorry," Grace said. "That must be lonely." "It is what it is." He adjusted Lily, who was starting to get drowsy, against his shoulder. "But Sunday, when you let me hold her, when she smiled at me, that was the first time in longer than I can remember that someone didn't flinch when I got close. Well, someone other than Rusty anyway. Rusty, the cat that lives in the tool shed. Orange, missing half an ear. He's my roommate, I guess." Thomas smiled slightly. "Not much of a conversationalist, but he doesn't judge." Grace found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time since Daniel died. A cat named Rusty. That's perfect. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees. Other visitors came and went. An elderly couple placing flowers on a grave. A man in a business suit who stayed for just a minute. A teenage girl who sat beside a headstone and played music from her phone. Some of them noticed Thomas and Grace sitting together. Grace saw the double takes, the way people's eyes widened when they spotted Thomas holding a baby. Let them stare, she thought. Let them talk. She knew what she'd seen in Thomas, and it wasn't anything to be afraid of. Over the following weeks, Wednesday afternoons became routine. Grace would finish her drafting work early, pack up Lily, and walk to the cemetery. Sometimes they'd sit on the bench while Thomas took a break from his work. Sometimes Grace would sit on a blanket near Daniel's grave while Thomas worked nearby, occasionally taking Lily when she got fussy, somehow always knowing exactly how to calm her down. He built a small bench under the oak tree where Daniel was buried, saying it was part of his job to maintain the grounds, but Grace suspected he'd done it specifically for her. She didn't mind. It was nice having a comfortable place to sit during her Sunday visits. Lily started calling for him when she saw him. Ta, her baby version of his name. She'd reach for him with both arms, and Thomas would scoop her up like she weighed nothing at all, his massive hands cradling her with impossible care. Grace told him about Daniel, about how they'd met in college, about their plans for the future that had been cut short. Thomas listened without trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. He just listened, and sometimes that was exactly what Grace needed. Thomas told her about growing up too big, too different, about his parents who loved him but didn't quite know what to do with him, about jobs he'd worked and places he'd left when the staring got too much, about the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost, he said one afternoon, watching Lily try to catch falling leaves, but not quite. Grace's mother did come that weekend, determined to talk sense into her daughter. But when she arrived at the cemetery for Grace's Sunday visit, she found something she didn't expect. Thomas was there working on the flower beds, and Lily was asleep against his chest while he planted bulbs one-handed, moving with such delicate precision that he didn't disturb the baby at all. Grace's mother stood at the cemetery gates watching this impossible scene. This giant of a man who'd had the whole town talking, cradling her granddaughter like she was made of glass. The baby's tiny hand was curled around his finger, and Thomas was humming something soft and tuneless while he worked. Grace saw her mother arrive and stood up from the bench, ready for the lecture, ready for the fight, but her mother just kept staring at Thomas and Lily, and slowly, something in her expression shifted. "Mom," Grace started, but her mother held up a hand. "Hush. I'm thinking." They watched Thomas work for another minute. He'd noticed them but didn't say anything, just kept moving slowly and carefully, protecting the sleeping baby. Finally, Grace's mother spoke. "He built that bench for you, didn't he? The one under the oak tree?" "Yes, and he's good with her." "With Lily?" "He is." Her mother sighed, and when she looked at Grace, her eyes were softer. "I came here to tell you that you were making a mistake. That grief was making you reckless. But watching him now," she shook her head, "maybe I'm the one who's been wrong. It was a small moment, just one person changing their mind. But it was a start." And in the weeks that followed, others in Millbrook began to notice what Grace's mother had seen. Thomas Crane, the man they'd all feared, was someone entirely different than they'd imagined. The question was whether the rest of the town would be brave enough to look past their fear and see the gentle giant who'd been there all along. The shift in Millbrook didn't happen overnight. It happened in small moments, tiny cracks in the wall of fear that had surrounded Thomas since he'd arrived. It started with Margaret Chen from the bakery. She'd seen Grace's mother at the cemetery that Sunday, had watched the older woman's face transform from concern to something softer. Margaret was a practical woman, and she trusted Grace's mother's judgment. So the next time Thomas came into the bakery for his weekly bread, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She smiled at him. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, using his name for the first time. "The sourdough just came out of the oven. Would you like a fresh loaf?" Thomas had frozen in the doorway, clearly expecting the usual nervous transaction. Yes, please. That would be nice. How's the work at the cemetery going?" Margaret asked, wrapping the warm bread in paper. "I heard you planted some beautiful chrysanthemums in the back section. You heard about that?" Thomas looked genuinely surprised. Small town. Margaret handed him the bread, and this time when their hands briefly touched during the exchange, she didn't pull away. "Grace Hayes mentioned it. Said you built her a nice bench too. That was thoughtful of you." Thomas left the bakery that day with more than bread. He left with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The following Sunday, more people noticed. Pastor William, who'd been leading services at Millbrook Community Church for 20 years, stopped by the cemetery to visit his late wife's grave. He found Thomas helping an elderly woman carry a heavy pot of flowers to her husband's headstone. "Let me get that for you, Mrs. Patterson," Thomas was saying, his voice gentle. "Where would you like it?" The old woman was pointing and directing, completely at ease, and Pastor William realized she wasn't afraid at all. He watched Thomas place the pot exactly where she wanted it, then carefully adjusted until she was satisfied. "Perfect," Mrs. Patterson said, patting Thomas's arm like he was her own grandson. "Thank you, dear. These old bones aren't what they used to be." After she left, Pastor William approached. Thomas saw him coming and straightened up, that familiar wariness crossing his face. but the pastor just extended his hand. "I don't think we've properly met," he said. "I'm William Reed, pastor of the church in town." Thomas shook his hand carefully like he was afraid of crushing it. "Thomas Crane. I know who you are, sir." "I've seen you working here for months," Pastor William said, looking around at the well-maintained grounds. "You do good work. The place has never looked better. Thank you. I also heard you've been helping Grace Hayes and little Lily." The pastor's eyes were kind, searching. "Grace is part of our congregation. Her mother told me how gentle you've been with them." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. "You should come to service sometime," Pastor William said. "Everyone's welcome. And I mean everyone." Thomas wanted to say that he'd tried going to churches before, that people always stared, that he felt like a spectacle. But something in the pastor's expression told him this invitation was genuine. "Maybe I will," he said quietly. "Good, we'd be glad to have you." And with that, Pastor William headed toward his wife's grave, leaving Thomas standing there feeling slightly dazed. But the real turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Grace had stopped by the cemetery with Lily, as had become their routine. Thomas was working on repairing a section of the iron fence, and Lily was playing in the grass nearby, rolling a ball back and forth with her mother. The baby was getting bigger now, more active, trying to pull herself up on anything she could reach. That's when they heard the screaming. A woman's voice, high and panicked, coming from the parking area near the front gates. "Help, somebody help. My boy fell in." Thomas dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his long legs covering the distance in seconds. Grace scooped up Lily and followed as quickly as she could. When they reached the parking area, they found a woman standing beside the old well that sat near the cemetery entrance. It was a decorative thing, supposedly sealed up years ago, but clearly something had gone wrong. The woman was leaning over the edge, screaming down into the darkness, "My son! He climbed up on the edge and fell through. Miguel, Miguel, can you hear me?" Thomas reached the well in 3 more strides. He looked down into the darkness and could see a small figure about 15 feet down, sitting in shallow water, crying. The boy looked about 8 years old, holding his arm at an odd angle. "He's hurt," Thomas called up, "but he's conscious." "How long has the opening been broken?" "I don't know. We just got here and he wanted to look inside and the boards gave way." The woman was sobbing now and a small crowd was starting to gather. Thomas assessed the situation quickly. The well opening was maybe 3 feet across, too narrow for most adults, but he might fit if he turned sideways. The bigger problem was that he probably weighed close to 300 pounds. The old stone walls might not hold him. "Someone call 911, he said. Then he started pulling off his work boots. "What are you doing?" Grace asked, clutching Lily close. "Going down after him. The fire department will take at least 15 minutes to get here with the right equipment. That boy's hurt and scared. He needs someone now." "Thomas, you're too big." "You'll get stuck." "Maybe, but I have to try." Before anyone could argue, Thomas lowered himself feet first into the well. He had to angle his shoulders and scrape against the stone walls, and Grace heard him grunt with effort. But inch by inch he descended into the darkness. The crowd at the top held their breath. Grace could hear Thomas talking to the boy below, his deep voice echoing up from the well. "Hey there, buddy. My name's Thomas. I know you're scared, but I'm going to get you out of here, okay? What's your name?" "Miguel," came a small, frightened voice. "Miguel." "That's a good, strong name. Can you tell me what hurts?" "My arm and my leg." "Okay, I'm almost down there with you. Just hold on." There was a splash, then Thomas's voice again, closer to the boy now. "All right, Miguel, I've got you. I'm going to pick you up now, and I need you to be really brave. Can you put your good arm around my neck?" More sounds from below, water splashing, stones scraping. Then Thomas called up, "I've got him, but I need help getting back up. The walls are too smooth, I can't climb with him." Someone in the crowd had called the fire department, and sirens could be heard in the distance. But Pastor William, who'd arrived with the growing crowd, took charge. "We need rope." "Does anyone have rope?" "I do." That was Mr. Henderson, who ran the hardware store. "In my truck, hold on." Minutes felt like hours. Thomas stood in the cold water below, holding Miguel against his chest, keeping the boy's injured arm and leg as stable as possible. Grace could hear him talking to the child, keeping him calm, telling him stories about Rusty the cat, about the birds in the cemetery, about anything that might distract from the pain and fear. When Mr. Henderson returned with the rope, they lowered it down. Thomas tied it around Miguel first, securing him carefully. Pull him up slow, he called. His arm and leg are hurt. The crowd worked together, hauling the boy up with aching slowness. When Miguel emerged, his mother grabbed him, sobbing and checking him over. The boy was crying but alive, and the paramedics who'd just arrived rushed over to stabilize him. "There's still a man down there," someone shouted. They lowered the rope again, but Thomas was a different challenge. It took 4 men pulling together to haul him up, his shoulders scraping against the stone, his shirt torn and bloody from the rough walls. When he finally emerged, he collapsed on the ground, breathing hard, covered in mud and blood and well water. Grace ran to him, still holding Lily. "Thomas, are you okay?" He nodded, unable to speak yet, just trying to catch his breath. His hands were torn up from gripping the stone walls, and there were deep scrapes across his shoulders and back. But Miguel was safe. That was what mattered. The paramedics wanted to check Thomas over, but he waved them off. "Take care of the boy. I'm fine." Miguel's mother approached then, tears streaming down her face. She was a small woman, barely coming up to Thomas's chest, and for a moment she just stared up at him. Then she threw her arms around him as far as they would reach, which was basically just his waist. "Thank you," she sobbed. Thank you. You saved my baby. You saved my boy." Thomas awkwardly patted her back with one bleeding hand. "He's going to be okay. Just some broken bones. Kids are tough." The crowd that had gathered wasn't whispering nervously anymore. They were looking at Thomas with something else in their eyes. Something that looked like respect. Like gratitude. Like they were finally seeing him for who he really was. Mr. Henderson from the hardware store stepped forward. "That was the bravest thing I've seen in my 40 years in this town," he said gruffly. "You risked your life for that boy." Thomas just shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Anyone would have done it. But no one else did," Pastor William said quietly. "You did." As the paramedics loaded Miguel into the ambulance, the boy looked back at Thomas and waved with his good hand. Thomas waved back, and Grace saw him smile, a real genuine smile that transformed his whole face. That night, the story spread through Millbrook like wildfire. But this time, the story wasn't about a frightening giant. It was about a hero who hadn't hesitated, who'd risked everything to save a child he'd never met. About a man who'd been gentle and brave and everything the town had failed to see in him. The next morning, when Thomas opened the door to his cottage, he found something he'd never expected. Gifts, casseroles and baked goods and thank you notes covering his small porch, flowers and cards and homemade cookies. The whole town, it seemed, wanted to say thank you. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Millbrook, Thomas Crane didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he might actually belong. The months following the well rescue changed everything for Thomas Crane. Millbrook wasn't just the place where he worked anymore. It was becoming something he'd never really had before, a home. People nodded to him on the street now, not with fear but with genuine friendliness. Kids who used to hide behind their parents' legs would wave at him from across the road. "That's the man who saved Miguel," they'd whisper excitedly to their friends. The hardware store clerk who used to drop coins now chatted with him about the weather while ringing up his purchases. Margaret Chen started setting aside an extra cinnamon roll for him every Saturday morning. "For all the good work you do," she'd say, waving away his money. Pastor William had convinced him to attend Sunday service, and now Thomas sat in the back pew every week, trying not to take up too much space but feeling welcome nonetheless. But the biggest change was with Grace and Lily. By the time spring rolled around, Lily was almost a year old and getting into everything. She'd learned to walk, wobbling around on unsteady legs, always heading straight for Thomas whenever she saw him. Her vocabulary had expanded beyond ta. Now she called him Thomas, which was close enough that it made his heart swell every time he heard it. Grace's Wednesday visits had stretched into other days too. Sometimes she'd stop by in the morning with coffee for both of them, sitting on the bench under the oak tree while Lily played in the grass. Times Thomas would help her carry groceries from her car when he saw her struggling in the parking lot. Sometimes they'd just talk about everything and nothing, the kind of easy conversation that comes when two people truly understand each other. Thomas had started keeping toys in his cottage, a stuffed rabbit, some blocks, a ball that Lily loved to throw for him to fetch like he was a very large dog. He'd even babysat a few times when Grace had tight deadlines for her drafting work, playing peekaboo and reading picture books in his deep, gentle voice that always made Lily laugh. He still visited Daniel's grave regularly, tidying the area, making sure the flowers Grace planted stayed healthy. Sometimes he'd talk to the headstone, telling Daniel about his day, about Lily's latest accomplishment, about how Grace had smiled at something Thomas said. It felt right somehow, keeping Daniel in the loop. One Saturday in May, Grace showed up at the cemetery with Lily and a picnic basket. "It's too beautiful to stay inside," she announced. "And I thought maybe we could have lunch together." "If you're not too busy." Thomas looked at the mower he'd been about to start, then at Grace's hopeful face, then at Lily, who was already running toward him with her arms up. "I think the grass can wait," he said, scooping up the little girl. They spread a blanket under the oak tree, and Grace unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and homemade lemonade. Lily sat between them, more interested in chasing butterflies than eating. It was one of those perfect spring days where the world felt full of possibility. "I've been thinking," Grace said, watching Lily toddle after a yellow butterfly. "Lily's first birthday is next month. I was going to have a small party, just family and a few friends, and I was hoping you'd come." Thomas went very still. A birthday party meant people. Lots of people. Grace's family, her friends, all gathered in one place. "Grace, I don't know." "Your family wants to meet you properly," Grace interrupted. "My mother's been asking about you constantly. She wants to thank you for everything you've done for us, and Lily would be heartbroken if you weren't there." "Would you be heartbroken?" The question slipped out before Thomas could stop it. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression made Thomas's breath catch. "Yes," she said softly. "I would be." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Lily discover a dandelion. The little girl picked it and brought it over to Thomas, presenting it like it was the most precious treasure in the world. "Thomas Fowler." "It's beautiful," Thomas said, accepting it with the same seriousness. "Thank you, Lily." Grace's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "You've become important to us. To both of us. You know that, right?" Thomas carefully tucked the dandelion behind his ear, making Lily giggle. "You've become important to me too. More than I probably should admit. Why shouldn't you admit it? Because I'm..." Thomas gestured at himself, at his size, at everything that made him different. "I'm not exactly what anyone would choose, for friendship or anything else." Grace reached over and took his hand, his enormous, scarred hand that had pulled a boy from a well, that had cradled her daughter through countless afternoons, that had planted flowers on her husband's grave. "You're exactly what we choose," she said firmly. "You're exactly what we need." Lily, oblivious to the weight of the moment, climbed into Thomas's lap and promptly fell asleep, worn out from chasing butterflies. Thomas held her carefully, one hand supporting her back, and Grace thought about how far they'd all come. How this man who'd been feared and avoided had become the safest place for her daughter to rest. How someone she'd almost been too afraid to trust had become the person she trusted most. "I'll come to the party," Thomas said finally. "If you really want me there, I really want you there." The birthday party was held in Grace's backyard on a sunny June afternoon. Thomas arrived early to help set up, hanging streamers from trees and inflating balloons, each one looking tiny in his massive hands. Grace's mother greeted him with a warm hug, and her father shook his hand with genuine respect. "Grace tells us you've been a godsend," her father said. "We can't thank you enough for looking after our girls." By the time the other guests arrived, Thomas had relaxed a little. There were about 20 people, family, friends from church, some of Grace's clients. Miguel's mother was there too, bringing her son who'd healed up just fine. The boy made a beeline for Thomas, chattering excitedly about how he'd told everyone at school about being rescued by a giant. But the moment everyone had been waiting for was when Lily saw her birthday cake. Grace had ordered a small cake decorated with flowers and butterflies. When she brought it out with a single candle lit, everyone gathered around to sing. Lily looked overwhelmed by all the attention, her little face scrunching up like she might cry. But then Thomas knelt down beside her high chair, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than frightening. "It's okay, Lily," he said softly. "These are all people who love you. See, your mama's right here. And I'm right here too." Lily's face brightened. She reached for him and Grace nodded, so Thomas lifted her out of the high chair. Holding her securely, he helped her blow out the candle, everyone clapping and cheering. Lily beamed, proud of herself, and planted a sticky kiss on Thomas's cheek. Grace's mother leaned over to her daughter. "He's wonderful with her. I know, Grace said, watching Thomas wipe frosting off Lily's face with a napkin, and the way he looks at you when you're not watching. Her mother trailed off meaningfully. Grace felt her cheeks warm. Mom, I'm just saying, Daniel would have liked him. He would have wanted someone good for you and Lily, someone kind. After the party, after everyone had left and the decorations had been taken down, Grace found Thomas sitting on her back porch. Lily was asleep inside, exhausted from her big day. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thank you for coming, Grace said, sitting down beside him. It meant a lot. To both of us, thank you for inviting me. I can't remember the last time I was at a party. Maybe never, actually. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've grown to know each other deeply. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm ready. Ready for what? To stop just visiting Daniel's grave and start actually living again. To let myself be happy without feeling guilty about it. She looked at Thomas. To see where this could go. If you want to, I mean. Thomas turned to face her, and in the fading light, Grace could see everything he felt written on his face. Hope and fear and affection, all mixed together. Grace, I mean, look at me. People will talk. They'll say you could do better. I don't want better, Grace interrupted. I want kind. I want gentle. I want someone who sees Lily as a blessing, not a burden. Someone who makes me laugh. Someone who understands loss but isn't defined by it. She reached for his hand again. I want you, Thomas. If you'll have us. Thomas looked down at their hands, hers so small in his, and felt something shift inside his chest. All his life he'd been too much. Too big, too different, too frightening. But with Grace and Lily, he was exactly enough. He was exactly right. I'd be honored, he said quietly, to have you both. To be part of your family, if you'll have me. Grace smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. I think we already do. Inside the house, Lily slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams one-year-olds dream. Outside, two people who'd both known loss and loneliness found something neither had expected, a second chance at happiness, and the courage to take it. The town of Millbrook had learned an important lesson through all of this. They'd learned that fear often blinds us to the goodness right in front of us, that children and babies, in their wisdom, sometimes see more clearly than adults, that strength and gentleness aren't opposites but partners, and that sometimes the people we're most afraid of are the ones who can teach us the most about courage, kindness, and what it truly means to be human. Thomas Crane had come to Millbrook looking for nothing more than a quiet place to exist. But he'd found something far better. He'd found a home, a family, and a love he'd never thought possible. And all because a widow had been brave enough to trust him, and a baby had been wise enough to see past his size to the gentle giant beneath. As for Grace, she'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding the courage to love again, to trust again, to believe that happiness is possible even after loss. Daniel would always be part of her story, part of Lily's story. But now there was room for a new chapter, one that included a gentle giant who'd shown them both what true kindness looked like. And Lily? Well, she'd always known, from that very first moment in the cemetery when everyone else saw something to fear, she'd seen exactly what mattered. A kind heart in a big package, a protector who would always be gentle, a friend who would always be there. Sometimes the smallest person teaches the biggest lesson. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is the willingness to see past the surface to what lies beneath.